Hello, this is Muriel, and today I'm going to talk about modeling the effects of dynamic saltmarsh and microphytobenthos on the large-scale morphology of estuaries. And I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Christian Schwarz, Lisanne Bratt, and Malte Kleinhans. So the overarching question of my PhD is how do eco-engineers determine estuary morphology? And I would like to illustrate what I mean by this nice picture of the Dovey estuary in the UK, which shows a very pretty channel bar pattern, and we see also some salt marshes and mudflats evolving. So we'd like to understand why does this morphology look the way it does. And on the one hand, obviously the morphology is driven by the hydrodynamics, which include tides and river discharge and associated sediment transport. But we also have geological constraints and human impact that restrict the evolution of this estuary. And as mentioned before, there are some species that live within the estuary and they act as eco-engineers, which means that they change their environment through their presence or their activity. And I would like to quantify how much they do that and to what extent. So this is what my presentation will be about. So one of the most prominent examples of marine eco-engineers is the saltmarsh vegetation. And saltmarsh acts as a biostabilizer because it reduces the erodibility of sediment and reduces morphological dynamics. This is because if water flows through the vegetation patch, it will be decelerated, which reduces flow velocities and will induce sedimentation in the vegetation patch. And this will, on the one hand, change the morphology, but also inundation periods and obviously flow velocities, which will feed back on the saltmarsh itself and might change its survival or mortality rates. So we have this feedback loop between the species changing their environment, but also being affected by these changes. And we need to incorporate this feedback loop between ecology and hydromorphology to actually capture the eco-engineering effects and species response and being able to reliably quantify what the effect of species in morphological evolution of estuaries is. Similarly, biofilms are another type of biostabilizers. We also call them microphytobenthos, which means that they sit down on the sediment and they stick the grains together because they secrete some substance that is very sticky and that will reduce the erosion of the sediment directly. So no extensive changes to the flow, but more direct stabilization of the mud. But also here there's a feedback between this change in environment by the biofilms and the response of the species to the environment that we need to incorporate to understand ecosystem engineering. I did develop a new eco-morphodynamic model that combines both this ecological and hydromorphological part. So on the one hand, we have the 3D model, which is a common software package that computes hydrodynamics, sediment transport, and morphology. And I couple this model with the MATLAB code that represents saltmarsh establishment, growth, and mortality. And the saltmarsh growth is determined by literature-based values, so values that are from field measurements or lab experiments. And then I couple these two models such that the hydrodynamics determine where the saltmarsh can establish, and when the saltmarsh grows or it dies, it will induce a drag force and a hydraulic roughness on the hydrodynamics and will directly change the flow and the sediment transport computations. On the other hand, the vegetation can die when the velocities become too high, or the inundation periods too long, or if the bed level changes lead to the burial or the erosion of the plant. So there's this direct feedback loop between the hydromorphodynamics and the saltmarsh growth. And I couple these two models pretty frequently, so every spring neap tidal cycle, which means that there is a direct update between the hydrodynamics and the species pattern and this direct feedback loop between the two of them. Similarly, I wrote a model for the biofilms, also in MATLAB, which is a bit more simplified, but also based on literature. So the biofilms can establish based on the inundation period and a certain mud cover in the top layer. And once they establish, they will change the erodibility of the mud, which will then reduce the erosion of the mud locally. So what makes this model special? Well, it's literature-based, as I already mentioned, which means that we do not need to calibrate the model to a certain area or model domain, but we can just couple the model to a hydromorphodynamic model and then see where the saltmarsh pattern evolves. We have different life stages that account for aging of the vegetation or for different succession stages. We can combine several species in the model. And I showed in my first publication that this model was able to represent saltmarsh establishment in a dynamic sandy estuary. Also, this model is now published on GitHub, so if you're interested in modeling saltmarsh and microphytobenthos, you can download the model and freely use it. So this presentation will be about biostabilizers, but also about mud, because mud is another type of stabilizer of the morphology. When mud exceeds large amounts in the top layer, it can develop a cohesive cover, which will then in turn also reduce the erodibility of the sediment. And as you see in this picture, mud and biota coexist. So we have a pretty dense mud layer in this tidal channel, but we are also confident that if we go into the saltmarsh and we look at the sediment and do a little of coring, we probably find a lot of mud as well in the saltmarsh sediments. So this leads to my first research question: what was then first there? So did we first have mud settling, which then in turn promoted the establishment of saltmarsh? Or did we have first the saltmarsh that needed to settle and then promoted mud settling through these eco-engineering effects? And I want to address this research question using my model. So I run a bunch of different scenarios. One is a generic saltmarsh, which is a blend of the most common saltmarsh species in northwestern Europe. Then a mud-dependent species, which means that the species requires mud in the bed in order to establish, which is known to be a strategy of some local saltmarsh species. We have a run with only biofilms to see how they affect the mud cover. We combine saltmarsh and biofilms to see if there is an interactive effect, and there is a reference run without any species effects as a control to see what happens without any biotic interactions. And I do tackle this question by using the Western Scheldt estuary, which is the southernmost estuary in the Netherlands. And this estuary has a lot of tidal bars and channels, as you can see in this DEM on top. But first, to understand the basic principles between mud settling, eco-engineering effects, and species establishment, I look at one specific tidal bar, which is in this blue rectangle, and that's the tidal shoulder Walsorden. And that's an interesting bar to study because there has been recent saltmarsh establishment. So as you can see in this mapping, which is based on aerial photography, that there was a little bit of saltmarsh establishment until 2004, and since then there has been an expansion of the saltmarsh towards a pretty big saltmarsh in 2015, and there's also a little bit of mud cover on this bar. Moreover, there exists a calibrated hydrodynamic Delft3D model and with an optimized morphology that I can use to couple to my vegetation and biofilm code to see if we can reproduce this saltmarsh pattern. So I use this domain, which is in the white rectangle, and I have a bit higher resolution grid for the tidal shoulder Walsorden, and then I compare the saltmarsh pattern from my model and the biofilms with the field data, and also link that to the mud cover to answer my research question. So this is the species pattern. So on the left hand side we have the ecotope maps, with the vegetation as seen in the previous slide. And then the first column, A, is the generic species, which is the blended species. And we see that there is a saltmarsh establishment on the bar with a dense core, basically linked to where also the dense vegetation is found in the data, and a sparse vegetation cover around. But there's not a big trend, so the vegetation settles and then it stays more or less the same and it doesn't change with time, which means that there is a slight overprediction of saltmarsh cover for 2004, but the further we get, the more similar the cover looks to the present day saltmarsh. And then on the right hand side we have the mud dependent species. So we have a slight saltmarsh coverage in the beginning, which resembles very much the one observed in the data. And then we have an expansion with time, so the saltmarsh can expand slowly because of the feedbacks of the eco-engineering that promotes mud settling, and then the saltmarsh can extend. So there's a difference in saltmarsh cover and development based on the establishment strategies of the different types of species. Then the next step is to look at the biofilms. So the column C is the biofilm, so the yellow area is the relative growth period of the microphytobenthos, and also that one expands with time, so the biofilm can persist longer on the bar with the establishment of the mud. And if we combine the generic saltmarsh and the biofilm, we see a combination of the generic cover in column A and the biofilms in column C, with the only difference that the biofilms expand a little more. So especially if we look in the northern part of the saltmarsh, the biofilm becomes more abundant around the saltmarsh edges. So if we combine saltmarsh and biofilms, the protective capacity by the saltmarsh will help the biofilm to expand more. Then obviously I'm interested in the mud cover. So this is the associated mud cover with the different scenarios. So in A we have again the generic species, and the brown colors are the mud fraction in the top layer, and the browner the more mud. So we see that there is a lot of mud right from the beginning, which becomes a little more, a little denser with time within the vegetation. And if we compare that to the mud-dependent species, there is a difference in mud coverage depending on the saltmarsh species. So the type of species seems to determine how much mud and where the mud can settle. And if we compare this then to the reference run, we see that without any vegetation present, there is also mud settling on the bar, especially in the southern tip, but the saltmarsh cover is much lower than if there's vegetation present. So in order to answer the question, what was there first, we can say that there are areas on the bar where the mud can settle without any vegetation, but in other places we require vegetation to promote mud settling. Here I added now the biofilm results and the results with the generic saltmarsh species and the biofilms. And if we compare the column C with the reference run to the very right, we see that there is not a very big difference between the mud fractions. So the biofilm seems to have a very little effect on the mud fraction on the bar. And if we look at the column D, where we had an expansion of the biofilm compared to the column C, and we compare this one to the column A with the generic species, we see that there is also not a large increase. So if we look at the northern side of the bar, where we saw that there was more biofilm in that area next to the saltmarsh, we still don't see that there is any more mud. So the biofilm seems to have a very limited effect, even with larger coverages. So to conclude, for my first research question, Depending on the species, vegetation can promote mud accretion where otherwise no mud can settle. Calm areas allow for mud settling prior to vegetation establishment. And vegetation establishment is partly determined by the sediment in the bed. So if there's mud in the bed, then a certain type of species can establish compared to a scenario without any mud. And biofilms have limited effects on the top mud fraction. So now I've been talking about the small scale, but what is with the estuary scale? So I used the entire estuary to look at the mud coverage there, only for the generic salt marsh on the top and the mud-dependent species on the bottom. And we see that there is a mud fraction on almost every bar. So the locations between the two salt marsh species seem to be similar for the mud cover, but there is a difference in mud fraction. So if we look at the very big bar to the very left, we see that there is pretty high mud fraction for the generic salt marsh species, while the mud-dependent species has lower mud fractions. So related with the expansion of the different species, we have also different mud fractions in the bed. So here, one more time to sum up, we have areas on the bar where mud can settle without any vegetation, and we have, depending on the species, mud settling in other locations where otherwise no mud can settle. Biofilms had limited effects on mud fractions, and on the estuary scale, mud areas enhanced depending on the species type. And just as information for those who are interested, these are the links to my two publications, and my model has been published with the publication of this year and can be found in the GitHub repository or under this DOI. And feel free to send me an email if you have any further questions. Thank you for your attention.